For this video lesson, I worked with 3 ELLs in 6th and 8th grades. These particular students have immigrated to the United States within the last couple of months from Mexico and Honduras. According to the federal government, ELLs are students between the ages of 3 and 21 who are enrolled in elementary or secondary education, often born outside the U.S. or speaking a language other than English in their homes, and not having sufficient mastery of English to meet state standards and excel in an English language classroom. The ELL population in the United States is growing more rapidly than educators and researchers have been able to keep up with pedagogy, criteria, and assessments for those students that qualify. These students in my class are members of a sheltered English classroom for one period every day. The job of this type of classroom is to guide and support them in the complicated process of learning English by developing instructional scaffolding within Vygotsky's Zone of Proximal Development, or ZPD. Through this short lesson introducing vocabulary and reading the fairy tale Goldilocks and the Three Bears, I aim to scaffold not only new concepts for the students, but the basic phonetics of the language through oral reading, vocabulary strategies like explaining cognates, and using L1 support within the vocabulary and the lesson. Because they are all fairly new students who have an extremely limited English proficiency, and this was their first real formal lesson in English, I decided to teach the lesson for the most part in their L1, Spanish. This situation was not ideal because I only got about 40 minutes with the students, we did not have time to finish the lesson, and the memory card in my camera filled up at 28 minutes. However, I did collect their vocabulary lists, and I have copies of what they completed during the lesson. We spent more time on vocabulary explanations and reading the story than I thought we would, but if there's one thing I have learned about teaching, it's that sometimes lessons are unpredictable.
Goldilocks and the Three Bears.
In class, the students are going over different genre and literature, so I decided to base my lesson upon a bilingual version of the fairy tale Goldilocks. The language was simplified and there were pictures to accompany the text. Not only are picture books short enough to read in one period, but they also help make visual and verbal connections for students who are learning English. I also created a PowerPoint presentation using English and Spanish as well as photos to define the vocabulary words from the text, giving students visual aid and L1 support. One of the most foundational aspects of planning for literacy activities with ELLs is that most lack either their core vocabulary or sufficient vocabulary to read fluently and or gather meaning from context.
House. ¿Qué es un house? Casa, sí. Okay. Entonces, house es casa. ¿Qué más? ¿Nada? Okay. Bueno, porque vamos a estudiar y
by asking students at the beginning of the PowerPoint if they knew any of the listed vocabulary words in English, they were able to informally practice a sort of knowledge rating by visually assessing the words to activate prior knowledge. Being that none of the students knew any of the vocabulary words and there were really no existing cognates, I spent a good amount of lesson time explaining words and having students write them in English and Spanish. I also had them repeat the words in English after I said them as a minuscule guided oral reading.
I am walking. Yo estoy caminando. I am walking. Okay? Caminar es walk. House. Norma ya sabía esta palabra. House. Casa. Y este es como una cabaña, ¿no?
Especially since these particular ELL students are new to English, I plan to take extra time pre-teaching vocabulary as well as explicitly modeling language skills and providing L1 support throughout the lesson, orally and textually. When I did use English during the lesson, I spoke slowly and deliberately using simple sentences, visual representations, and L1 words with which students paired up their new English vocabulary.
All right. Entonces, house. 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 Bueno. Sí. Mouse y house. Okay, sit. Sentarse. Es una abuelita. Sit. Y entonces sit es un verbo. Sit is a verb porque es una acción. Puedes sentar. ¿Sí?
We talked about words that perform actions and how they are called verbs, and I acted out the verbs that we talked about using simple sentences in English, usually in the present progressive tense. The use of gestures, visual aids, and hands-on experiences helps ELL students to see, hear, and mimic words, bringing them to life.
Tenemos un chair grande, un chair mediano y un chair pequeño. Sí. Sí. Entonces, grande es large, mediano es medium, and pequeño es small. Y algunas palabras en español se llaman cognates y, por ejemplo, mediano y medium se parecen. Entonces es más fácil saber qué son. También en español, cuando tienes un silla que es mediano, dices un silla mediana, ¿no? Pero en inglés, exactly. Medium chair, or large chair, or small chair. Puedes ver en el cuento. Sleep. Sleep, dormir. Entonces, ¿esta palabra es una cosa o una acción?
I purposefully chose not to use dictionaries in this lesson for two main reasons. I had observed in the past couple of weeks that two of these students are not proficient in using a dictionary, which is a lesson in itself. And especially for beginning language learners, dictionaries can be confusing because of multiple meanings of the same word and even counterproductive. Taking opportunities to study the vocabulary in the text was much more beneficial in this case, especially because students saw the English word in the context-rich text alongside the Spanish translation and the bilingual storybook.
En inglés, papá y mamá pueden ser father y mother. Okay? Run es correr. Okay? Entonces, ¿es una acción o una cosa? Una acción, sí. Entonces es un verbo. ¿Cómo? Como puedes correr, es una acción que haces.
¿Cómo se dice?
Run. Puedo decir, I like to run. Yo me gusta correr. Podemos repasar nuestro vocabulario en inglés, ¿ok? Walk. Walk. Forest. Forest. House. Sit. Chair. Hungry. En inglés, medium. Small. Okay. Perfecto. All right. Ahora vamos a leer. Yani, puedes empezar.
Todo.
Sí, en español.
We moved on to reading the fairy tale. The students took turns reading in Spanish, and then I modeled the English reading, pointing to the words of the text that I read. We looked together at the English and the Spanish vocabulary within the story and talked about the pictures in the book as well, pointing out the depicted vocabulary words. After reading the story in its entirety and discussing what happened in the book, we began to discuss the writing activity and then had to end our lesson.
In the middle of the forest, she saw a little house. Entonces, Goldilocks. All right. En el bosque. In the forest. A little chair. And it was just right. ¿Qué significa just right? Just right.
The writing activity was supposed to consist of students drawing 3 depictions of what happened in the story using English vocabulary to label their pictures, allowing students to display proficiency in a different medium. After students finished drawing and labeling, we would have concluded the story in a simple sentence and then have students share their pictures, practicing speaking the words in English. I also would have liked to have students write about their reactions to the text, answering a simple question like, if you were a bear, would you have been mad at Goldilocks? Why? In a learning log, allowing students to write in Spanish or English. I think these students would have responded well to this assignment because there's no pressure to write correctly, but rather just to get ideas down on paper. Before students left, which is not on the recording because of my memory card, I gave them all individual word study books or language journals to use throughout their day during their other classes. I told them to write down words in English that they wanted to know and either look them up or ask a friend or family member what they mean. I also told them to define words in ways that would help them remember. Define the word in Spanish, write the Spanish word, draw a picture, write an example. Do whatever they need to do to learn the meaning of the word. I used no formal assessment during this lesson. However, throughout the lesson, I assessed whether I thought the students understood my explanations and the reading through questions about the text and about new vocabulary. Because these students are new to school in the United States, their assessment should be based less on tests and grades and more on content and performance, which is more closely tied to what actually happens in the classroom. I had a good time planning and implementing the lesson despite the technological hiccups and lack of time or multiple lessons. Reflecting back on the lesson, I wish I had spoken more English throughout, although I think students would not have understood it as thoroughly. Also, in the guided oral reading procedure within the lesson, I should have had the students repeat the English reading after me to maximize the amount of time any one student spends practicing fluency. But on the other hand, I think repeating this much text in English might have been outside of these particular ELL students' zones of proximal development. So single vocabulary words or simple sentences was probably enough in English.